Back in the 60s, a long time ago, though I'm so old, I can remember it, the UK government was very interested in the technological revolution, and they thought it would be held back by a lack of skills. And the result of all that was a new act passed by the government to develop industrial training boards. Now, I mention this because we have somebody from an industrial training board here today. These were not employer-led, but employers were involved through their trade associations. And what they had to do was to develop training programs that were suitable for employers and for industry. So it wasn't that the educational institutions provided what they thought was useful. This was what, working together, they believed would be effective. And the most important part of that process, because we need to think about these issues later, is the way that it was funded, paid for. And it was paid for by a levy grant system, which meant that most employers had to pay for the training board, a bit like a tax, but they paid for it. But if they then provided training that was relevant to the needs of their organizations, they would get some money back. And it meant that employers were paying for training. It was supported by government, but they were committed to training, and the training was relevant. There were only about 27 of these in the end, and therefore the government eventually, with a change of government, I'm sure it's the same in Mexico, you have a change of government, everything changes. And many of the industry training boards disappeared, and they were replaced by a number of different bodies over time. But most recently, 2001 to 2, we developed sector skills councils, and again, we have someone later today from a sector skills council. Now, these are completely employer-owned. They're not owned by the government. That's a really important factor. The government licensed them for a long time, which meant they had to fulfill certain criteria to make sure they received some support funding, but they were run by employers, and they still are run by employers. So they've come a long way to a new scenario. And these sector skills councils, their job was not even to train people. Their main task was to ensure that we knew exactly what the skills needs were in our industries. So we carried out research, and then to develop some very clear standards for industry so you could base training programs on those standards. And they included in their membership, although remember employers owned them, they included representation from trade unions, always from education, and sometimes from government. The government licensed them, and they still exist today. There are around 16 of them. Most of these are sector skills councils, but there are some industry training boards, as you can see, that have stood the test of time. That's the 17th one at the bottom. So their activities vary, their sources of funding vary, but today they still work closely with employers to make absolutely certain that the training that young people and older people receive is relevant to the world of work in which they're going to be based. And so you see we have a structure which is essentially three-way. Employers lead, and that's the important thing to remember, that it's a partnership, but it's a partnership led by employers, working with government and working with education at all levels of education. And that is the principle on which we work, and it seems to work extremely well and has improved the quality of training that we find and develop within the United Kingdom. The UK system is demand-led, and these sector skills councils and similar bodies do work with a parent or an overall organisation called the UK Commission for Employment and Skills that is run by the government. And they help to provide resources and research that employers can work with more effectively. And also they provide the resource to develop occupational standards, and I'll come back to those in a second. Now, I mentioned the overarching body, the government body, the UK Commission for Employment and Skills, and they do provide some money for skills development in the United Kingdom. You see 3 of them there, but we're talking about many millions of pounds. Their main role, apart from research, which we'll look at in a second, is to encourage employers to invest more themselves in skills. So these programs that you see on the screen are really designed to encourage employers to invest further themselves, to see the results of that investment, and then, of course, to continue to invest in skills development. And really important in that process, then, is the concept of labour market information, or labour market intelligence, how we ensure that we know what it is that industry needs. So if we look at the energy industry, for instance, how do we know what skills young people are going to need within the workplace? How do we know what skills they're going to need tomorrow? Where are the skills gaps? Where are the skills shortages? That's the kind of information we need. And we also need to know how effective skills development is in terms of improving profitability, improving efficiency and effectiveness, and not forgetting also improving safety. So it's a really important area. And the UK Commission for Employment and Skills does a great deal of work. You can see on the top circle, for instance, 90,000 interviews in just one of their surveys.